Hungry Trilobyte podcast would like to acknowledge conventions such as WhedonCon. WhedonCon is a fan-generated charity event for Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Angel, Firefly, and all Joss Whedon creations. It is scheduled for October of 2020 and is held in Los Angeles, California. Portion of the proceeds benefit the Los Angeles LGBT Center, as well as the Ron Glass Memorial Scholarship. See details at WhedonCon.com.
On mic today, we have Frank Cifaldi. How are you doing this fine morning, sir?
Good. How are you?
I am fantastic. I am really eager to talk to you because I don't get enough gaming content on this channel, and hopefully this will be a good chance to change that a little bit. Now, you are a gaming historian, just to start.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I've been a journalist in the industry going back to something like 2003, maybe. But I've always been sort of focused on the preservation angle of it. So yeah, by extension, I guess calling me an historian's fair. I've done some published work, but there's also the part of me that's like, well, I don't write very often anymore, so I don't know if this is the right term.
I think it's fair.
Okay, sure. Let's call me an historian. Let's go for it.
Preservationist is good. Now, it's weird because I have always loved gaming ever since back to the original NES, and I've been into preservation since the day I upgraded from that and said, well, I don't want to leave my old stuff behind.
Right.
But I feel like I went to sleep one day in the not too distant past when nobody else cared about preservation, and I woke up in the morning and everybody cared about it.
Yeah, I kind of feel that way sometimes too. I mean, when do you think that shift happened? Because I don't even know.
I really think it was less than 5 years ago.
Yeah, I think it was. I think it was when companies started actually republishing their back catalogs in mass, as opposed to it being a niche product. Yeah, I think I agree with you. Like, even if that were the case, even some of the things I worked on kind of contributed to that a little bit, because I had a brief career designing and producing collections of classic games, and we always had that sort of like preservation angle in the PR where we tried to dig up all the concept art and the stories and stuff like that. And yeah, I think you're right. I think people are really starting to pay attention to this stuff. I think they're understanding that a lot of material is volatile and endangered and is probably lost. And I think another thing that kicked it off that scared people a lot was the disappearance of PT. Do you know PT?
I don't.
So PT was a free demo that Konami put out on the PlayStation 4 that was sort of a stealth demo. You didn't know until the very end. It was a preview of a new Silent Hill game that got canceled, and then they pulled the demo from the store forever. So I think a lot of people, their first taste of fear that video game history could disappear from under them was the sudden inability to ever play PT again. This was a big project. This was Guillermo del Toro and Hideo Kojima like co-producing a Silent Hill game, and it's been wiped by its corporate owner from existence. So I kind of trace a lot of it to that too, but I digress.
No, it's actually a really good digression because, for most of my life, the attitude was always, well, who cares if Big Shooter 3 is out now because Big Shooter 4 is right around the corner. I don't care about Big Shooter 1, 2, and 3 anymore.
Yeah.
And now suddenly it's like the world woke up. It's like, well, I don't want to lose those old games. I'm just amazed at how widespread the shift was and how quickly it happened after people like you and I felt like this forever.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. It's not been very hard to convince people that video game history is important and we should save it. So yeah, it's made my life a little bit easier.
Agreed. Would you compare it to film preservation or art preservation of any other kind?
You mean the state of it, or
the state of it?
Do it?
Not only how we do it, but maybe the mindset behind it, the priorities behind it.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to. There's some comparisons you can make to film preservation, and I often do that are fair. I think the one that makes the most sense is when we talk about what the Film Foundation usually talks about, which is that I forget the stat, but it's something like 80% of movies American cinema made before 1929 is gone now. It just doesn't exist anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason it doesn't exist anymore is because back then uh, there was no reason to keep it. There was no reason for a studio to have an archive of film because back then you'd make the movie, you'd print reels, you'd sell them to theaters, and you'd wipe your hands of it. You'd be done, right? There was no sense of re-releasing a movie because no one wants to watch an older movie. There was no secondary market, right? There's no television broadcast rights. There's not even television, right? There's no home video. There's nothing. There was no secondary market. We don't see studios start to keep their films around until we start seeing that secondary market, which I believe started with people wanting to see movies again in the theater after they were done. And I think the same exact thing happened to video games in the early days when coding a game was a direct communication with the machine itself. Like if you're making an NES game, a Sega Genesis game, you are writing, machine language code to talk to that specific machine. And the thought of archiving that for some future use, I'm sure in the back of a lot of people's heads, they knew it was important and tried, but there was very little incentive for a company to maintain that archive. Because there was not really a sense of like, well, we'll do a remaster on the next platform. That's, that wasn't really a thing for a long time. And I would say that hasn't really been a thing in the industry in any major way until the last, you might be onto something like 5-ish years or so, right? That where the idea of an HD remaster on the next gen became kind of understood. So I think that the big companies are probably doing an okay job now archiving the raw material that went into making their games. But I think that prior to maybe this last generation, that it was kind of rare. And when we tend to see the archives still exist for an older game, it's usually because someone took it home, like someone literally like stole from work. And that's another good film history comparison too, because you often find like lost movies or Doctor Who episodes or whatever, like in someone's closet, forgotten, and so you see that as well. But where I think the comparison falls apart a little bit is that in Hollywood or even television production, you tend to see, more of a studio system, right? Where there's maybe like 5 major companies that own everything, if that. I don't know. I think they're all owned by Disney now. But, you tend to see not very many companies and they have their own archives. Whereas in video games, publishers have come and gone rapidly for the entire duration of this industry. And so, a lot of that material kind of died with them and didn't have a new home to go to, and so is lost forever.
I'm also just thinking here while you're talking, I'm thinking it, in television, for the majority of the material ever made, advertising paid for it and the consumers got it free. And with video games, it's almost the exact opposite. You usually bought most of your games outright. And I'm wondering if that ever played into the fact that with video games, you knew that the customer was the person who was viewing it was your customer directly, and you wanted to offer them as much as possible.
Yeah, and that actually is the bright side to video game preservation, is that most of the older titles were directly sold to the consumer, unlike film, right? So we are in a fortunate position, actually, where most of video game history, if you know where to look, if you are comfortable with emulation, etc., most of video game history you can actually revive and play, if you're willing to put in the work to do it. But excuse me. What I think we're in danger of losing, though, is not the playable games themselves. It's the context to understanding those games. And that's what most of my work focuses on, is preserving not just the playable game, but understanding how it was made, why it was made, who it was made for, what people who played it at the time sort of thought about it, right? Just contextualizing these things. And going back to the film comparison, because in the games industry, like we can't help but do this. It's like, I don't know, Citizen Kane's kind of a good example, where it's an enjoyable movie on its own. But if you understand the context in which it was made, if you understand who William Randolph Hearst was, if you understand who Orson Welles was, if you understand that rivalry, then that movie becomes a different work entirely. Like it transforms that work. And so, I think in a lot of cases, you can probably say the same about a lot of works, that if you understood them, it transforms their meaning completely. And I want to see a world where we understand games beyond the level of just a consumer buying a product, and understand the thought processes that went into them and the decision making and things like that. So that's why in my line of work, what we tend to focus on a lot are trying to rescue those raw materials that went into making the game, so that if an historian is writing the book on the making of Super Mario Brothers or whatever, they might be able to access material that would support a book about the making of Super Mario Brothers.
And Super Mario Brothers being an interesting example, I know you put in, to somebody who doesn't follow this stuff, you put in a crazy amount of effort into just figuring out the exact day the game was released.
Yeah, I did. I was trying to prove a point. So this was years ago when I was the editor at a website called Gama Sutra. No, I didn't name it. That was still is. It's a resource for people who make games, as sort of news and features and tutorials and things like that to help people make better games. But we also were interested in the history of where game development came from, so we would report on that stuff too. And the point I was trying to prove is just how little we know about video game history. And I happened to see on a Super Mario fan site that no one had really been able to substantiate exactly when the game was first available in the US. And I spent, you're right, I spent a good couple weeks calling everyone I knew who was at Nintendo at the time, calling Toys R Us, because they had corporate records going back to FAO Schwartz, where the system and the game were first sold, and just trying to substantiate a date when Super Mario Brothers was sold, which was, that's to switch analogies to comics, right? Like I think of Super Mario Brothers as like Action Comics #1, right? Like that's to me the birth of what we think of as video games now, as opposed to the things before. And I was unable to substantiate the release date for Super Mario Brothers. But yeah, and I mean, I brought that up as an example. It's kind of a bad one because I don't expect the Iron Curtain to ever be lifted from Nintendo's internal archives. I don't think we're ever going to really get a peek inside beyond what they're willing to show us. But as it is a good example of a game to me that's worthy of its own, documentary, history book, etc. on shelves. And that's something that we at the Video Game History Foundation, which is the charity that I run, we bring that up a lot, that if you were able to go to a bookstore right now and you looked at the shelves, you like, if you went to which one's still around? Barnes and Noble, Borders Guide, Barnes. Yep. Okay, so you went to Barnes and Noble right now, and I have, we took pictures of this, for like presentations and stuff. You go to the music section, right? There's just like 3 gigantic shelves full of like biographies of musicians and
Mhm.
and critical theory and stuff like that, right? Go to film, it's the same thing, right? There's like 6 books about Citizen Kane in print right now, and then you go to the game section and it's literally like art books and strategy guides. There's
Mhm.
some game history books, yes, but it hasn't hit that critical mass where you can just go to the bookstore and grab a video game history book very often. And when you do, it tends to be like the overarching corporate history of all of video games, as opposed to like a book about a specific game. Now we've seen some good stuff. We've seen, these. I don't know if you've seen Boss Fight books. They do these small books that focus on individual games. We've seen some, but it's not nearly what we see for anything else. And we think it's because there's just no material to reference to do this kind of work.
I remember for the longest time, and I mean only until about 3-4 years ago, if you talked about video game history books, you would have Zap, you'd have the Phoenix,
Yep.
and you would struggle to come up with a number 3.
Yeah, you'd get Stephen Kent's book. I forget what it's called, Ultimate History of Video Games, and then David Sheff's Game Over, and that's it.
Forgot about Game Over. Okay, so even
Masters of Doom. Of Doom. That was the other. Like, there were about like 10 that was just like that's the canon. But yeah, it's true. And again, going back to those books, it's like most of them weren't focused on specific things. They were more like overarching views of typically the high level business dealings of video games as history, right? As opposed to the artistry of video games, right? Or the evolution even of like playing games. I don't even know if I've seen really good critical work on the evolution of game players, right? And we just, that should exist. There's obviously a lot of interest. Almost every old console has been re-released in miniature form as of this recording. And people just buy them up like crazy. I think there's a massive interest in video game history that is going unserved. I think that even comes down to simple merchandising, right? Like I think that, I don't know why there's not like Funko Pop figures for fans of like Castlevania or whatever. Just like there's just this weird dearth of video game history being celebrated and available versus what I think is a tremendous audience for this sort of thing. And it's weird. And that's kind of what we're, hoping to change in the world is giving more resources to people to be able to understand and contextualize the stuff.
And I think that there's now a desire on the part of some people who haven't played games in years to at least not play what's out there now, but maybe to reach back to something they were comfortable with, something that they would like to experience again. And we just now are giving them the tools to do that commercially.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think a lot of what we call like lapsed gamers, people who maybe played games in their youth and stopped because they became parents or whatever. I think a lot of those people look at modern games and only really see the ones that are being pushed to them, the sort of gigantic, multi-million-dollar budget prestige titles. And I think if what you're used to is a more bite-sized experience, excuse me, that the thought of playing these games, sometimes you might even try to play those games. And this is not at all a slam against modern game design, but games have gotten the AAA top tier games have gotten a lot more complicated, right? And there's sort of this expected, like even hour-long-ish tutorial in a lot of these games, stuff like that. And again, this is not an insult. It's just that, to your point, a lot of people, I think, are missing what games used to be, not because they were better, but because you couldn't do an hour-long interactive tutorial and multiple system designs and things like that on a 16-bit platform, right? So I do think a lot of people start looking backwards. I wish they would start looking under the hood instead at the incredible work being done by indie developers right now.
Yeah.
But I think I agree. A lot of people are looking backwards for some kind of comfort for the way games used to be, for sure. And I think that for the most part, the way the industry has responded to that is to just dig up the same list of like 100 games that the publishing rights are easy to clear up for, and just like keep shoveling them out at like $8 a pop and hoping for the best, which is I talk about that all day with my work with Digital Eclipse, but I don't know if you want to go there.
Well, I'm up for anything. But I agree with you there. It does seem to me like there could be, I don't want to say innovation, because I'm not saying we have to just reinvent the wheel, but I think a lot of people would benefit from having access to, like you said, the 100 games right off the bat when they get a new piece of hardware, and then from there branch off into something else.
Yeah, maybe, but I also think that when people buy these retro consoles, they play them for half a day and then put them in the closet. You know, I think people don't actually want to play old games. I think they want to play old games. I think they want to have a nostalgia rush and feel good and then move on with their lives. So I don't know that I think people are actually clamoring to revisit the classics in any meaningful way. I think that when people actually sit down and like play through an old game, I think that's, you know, to me, that's the equivalent of people who are into old movies. It's a niche thing. It's an acquired taste, right? And I worked for a company briefly called Gametap. It was a Turner Broadcasting product in like the mid-aughts, like 2005 to maybe 2007, something like that.
I remember hearing about this.
Yeah, so we were games on demand. It was a subscription rate. You paid us, I think, $10 a month, and you got a client that gave you access to 1,000 games going all the way back to like Combat on the Atari. And the behavior we found is that almost no one stuck on an old game. Everyone launched Pac-Man once, you know, but no one like tried to actually learn and master Pac-Man, right? Like I think those days are past. But I think that I don't think people want to. Okay, we are getting into this. Here we go. You got me going on this.
Hey, that's great.
I think that I know we don't play games the way we used to. We don't get an old game, and that's our only source of entertainment for the next 2 months. You know what I mean? Other than watching broadcast TV. I think the idea of just handing a game as it was to someone and going have fun, you're going back to your youth, I think that's a flawed idea. I think people want to experience the joy they remember, but I think that for the most part, older games just cut and pasted as is not the path toward that. So when I've worked on commercial projects where we have reintroduced old games, I've tried to make products that, what we always said at Digital Eclipse when I worked on the games was that we want people to feel like they got their money's worth even if they didn't even play the games that are on here. So what we tried to do was hand you a product that was less just a compilation of games and more of like an interactive coffee table book about the games.
Okay.
So for example, the last product that I produced and directed was called SNK 40th Anniversary Collection. And that was a product of games by a publisher called SNK that most people remember them for the Neo Geo system, for things like King of Fighters. And even though they didn't make it, they think of like Metal Slug and stuff like that. But we had an opportunity to spotlight what SNK was before that, all the games they made in the 70s and 80s. And so when we made that product, I came at it from the perspective of thinking that there wasn't much of an existing fan base for these games specifically, but there was an audience of people interested in the history of SNK. And so what we did was, rather than pretend that these were hot titles and we could sell a product based on the merits of it having these games, we tried to put together the definitive package for the video game history fan of what this company was, because that had never really been captured. No one had ever, like, there's almost nothing out there before this product about the making of Ikari Warriors, Athena, things like that, Psycho Soldier. So we put together a compilation, and luckily SNK was really cool about letting us choose titles that frankly weren't even very good in some cases, because we felt that they represented the artistry of SNK by being included in this compilation, as opposed to just finding the ones that are fun now. So things like we got to include a game called Joyful Road, which is like a game about driving a car that has arms and is like eating fruit off the side of the road and like throwing the apple rinds in the trash as it's running from the police. Just this weird game that's like not that good.
That is so 80s.
Yes, it's exactly, and it represents this company at their experimental prime. And within that product, we have the sort of interactive history book going through all of even the games that aren't in the compilation. We show them, at least. We tell you what they were. If we know anything about how they were made or who made them, we kind of give you that information. And again, like, to me, that's the way you present older games to people who are interested in the history, is to give them basically a you could say coffee table book or virtual museum or whatever, however you want to say it, because I think, and I've given 2 industry talks at GDC about this, I think the audience for people who just want to be handed an old game to play, that audience ages out real quick. Like I think like, exactly. I think there's only so many times you can charge me $8 for essentially MAME with one game on it before I burn out and stop buying. And I think we need to think a little bit harder about what it is that people actually want when they think they want old games, which is, my perspective is the celebratory history. And another feature we added real quick, and I'm not trying to sell the game, I don't get any money from it, is for every game in the collection, I actually recorded a playthrough of the game that you can just watch instead. So you don't even have to play the game. So you could just watch me play, and you could scrub through it like a movie. And at any point you can take the controller away from me and just jump in and play it.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's a really cool feature. But to me, again, I don't think people want to really learn how to play tank or whatever. There's a tank game on there that's actually really interesting, but I don't think people are actually going to sit down and learn that game, is what I suspect. But if you're able to watch it and scrub around and like just passively observe it, and if you want, even like take control and try that part yourself to see how it works, I think instead of being, again, handed a game and being told like, hey kid, good luck, pretend it's the 80s, like, I think that then helps you to understand and contextualize that game way better than just kind of being handed a quarter and a joystick and saying go. So I don't know where we were going with this, but I think that the common commercial way of re-releasing an old game, I like to liken it to, you familiar with a store called Big Lots?
Yes.
So when I used to shop at Big Lots, near the checkout stands, there were like these packs of like 400 cowboy movies on DVD for $20, and like, to me, that's what most game publishers do with their legacy of content, is just like bundle them up without thinking and just like here's a value pack of old stuff, and that's sort of the hook, is that it's a good value, and I think that's just cheapening these old titles, and creating a situation where people just think of them as cheap as opposed to something worth actually looking back on. So that's my spiel. that's two GDC talks condensed to about 5 minutes or whatever.
Well, that was solid. That was really good. I do kind of wonder, I mean, because I haven't worked in development for a very long time, but part of me wonders if like the magic bullet is to manage to take Skyrim, condense it down so you can play it with an NES controller, and then cut off the tutorial. I mean, would that be just the magic spell that everybody can like? Or
that brings lapsed gamers back into video games?
Yeah. It's hypothetical.
You're still, if it's Skyrim, no matter how much you simplify the mechanics, it's still a game that costs an absurd amount to make, and has to be marketed to an audience. And I don't think that alienating the substantial market that exists for complicated games in order to bring back lapsed gamers is probably a pretty bad commercial move.
Fair enough.
But there's been some interesting attempts, I think, to bring back lapsed gamers. I think the only one that worked was the Wii, but it only worked for like 5 minutes because every parent bought a Wii and bought like Wii Fit and then never bought another game. So it did well for Nintendo, but not the rest of the industry. You might have seen that there's an attempt right now to bring back the Intellivision brand as a family console.
I've seen that. I have opinions.
Yeah, same. Interesting idea. I don't think it's realistic, but it's at bare minimum, it is at least an attempt to make a commercial console product to appeal to a market that we see as being lapsed. Personally, I just don't think it's much of a market. I don't think there's a lot of people who are going to spend a lot of money and like get back into video games as a hobby if they've already left it. I think that train has left the station.
Fair enough.
But that's just my blunt commercial opinion. I'm happy to be wrong.
I would love to be wrong too. But we're talking about the release of Super Mario Brothers, and I might have a historical nugget, a fairly insignificant one, but you might enjoy hearing this.
Let's go.
One of my close personal friends is the first person in the state of Oklahoma to ever play Super Mario Brothers.
Okay, how do you substantiate that? What does that mean?
Okay, before the actual 1985 test market release of the Nintendo console.
Yeah.
His father was working for what would eventually become the distributor for the console in the state, and he got to bring the console home to play before it was finished with the test market.
Okay.
Cool. So probably not the first person in the country, but the first person in this state. The only console that was in the state was in his house.
Nice. Does he still have it?
No.
Okay. Because I was gonna say that low serial number is gonna do good for him on eBay.
At least I don't think so, but I could ask.
You should ask, because he might have. I mean, people are those NES collectors are pretty hardcore, and there is a database of like lowest serial numbers and where they live, and he might have a really good one.
I didn't know the thing about the serial numbers. That's new to me.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Yep.
So, but yeah, NES collecting, that was where I really got into, preservation and history. And I was one of those people, I want a full set, and I left that idea behind a while back now.
Me too. Long time ago for me. I actually have a moment where it stopped, like a very specific moment. So I'm talking like early 2000s. Like I was collecting games when you could actually just kind of go to thrift stores and do that. Mm-hmm. And it was, I think 2002 or something. I had just left a Funko land where I had purchased a complete in-box copy of Home Alone 2 on the NES. And I opened the trunk of my car and I set it down and I just kind of stared at Macaulay Culkin's face for a second. And I'm like, I'm never going to play this. Like, I have no, why do I need to own this? Why is this going in my house and taking up space? Like, what am I doing here? And I sold off my collection months later, almost in its entirety. But yeah, I had the same sort of, I think I started also with just like, oh, I remember the NES. I want to recapture the NES, and then just kind of, got bored and moved on quickly from that and tried to figure out the larger issues when it came to preservation.
Well, that's actually the exact reason I wanted to reach out to you and get you on here, because when I really got hardcore into NES collecting, it was the mid to late 90s. The NES was just finally disappearing off the store shelves, and I found things like NES World on the internet, TSR's Internet Archive, NES Nation, all those little oddball, low print run games, foreign releases.
NES World is still going, by the way.
Yeah, it really is. But I was like, I realized there was this huge mystery world behind specifically the Nintendo. I found out later it doesn't really exist for the Super Nintendo or the Genesis, but the NES is like the freaking Twilight Zone of video game consoles.
Oh yeah.
And go ahead. Sorry.
Well, yeah, I mean, to your point, like there's this world we didn't know of until the internet of like porn games on the Nintendo and stuff like that, right? Yeah.
So I'm like, I need to get every one of these games because somebody has to have them. And it was years later I realized, okay, there's other people doing this too. It's not all on me. And I was thankful.
Yeah.
If I hadn't found out people like you and Pat Contry and all those other guys who are cataloging and archiving, I'd still be doing it.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that is kind of hard to grasp for a lot of people with the charity I run, specifically the Video Game History Foundation. We have a really large archive of video game stuff. We have, almost every American video game magazine, for example, right? We have a lot of books. We have a lot of press material, things like that. But we don't collect retail games. We just don't bother. And the reason is exactly what you're saying. It's people have done that already. Like there's a very vibrant, healthy market of collectors who are collecting games. So why do we need to also do that? What does that get us? So we just don't bother collecting retail games unless it's, there's some weird, rare exceptions. Like, we have a box in storage that was donated of like complete in box classic Macintosh games. And it's like, there's not a lot of people who are actually collecting this stuff. And for us, we accept stuff like that. And it's like, we might not be the forever home for these. We might not bother, but let's at least like keep them in a safe place. And if there's a home that makes more sense later, we'll place it. But yeah, we don't, I've been offered things like, big boxes of, complete in box Super Nintendo games or whatever. And then I've told them that, I'm always upfront. It's like, if you want to donate those to us so that we can sell them, cool. Like we're happy to do that. But if you're looking for a permanent home for these, we just don't bother because there's so many more permanent homes. Not just the collectors, but places like the Strong Museum of Play, for example, collects retail games. So like let's funnel them over there. The Made Museum here in Oakland even collects retail games. There's universities that collect retail games. Those are fine. We collect the things that no one else is really focusing on. Go ahead. Oh, but I got sidetracked a little bit because you were talking about the weird hidden world of the NES, and like that's still something that's interesting to me. And last year I put a lot of effort into what I thought was the final frontier of the like hidden NES stuff, which is that a lot of these like what we call plug and play systems, these controllers that you just plug into a TV and you put batteries in. A a lot of those are actually running a clone of the NES hardware.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a lot of plug and play systems that totally fell through the cracks that had original software written for the NES embedded on them that were trapped in these things. Some of them were licensed. Oh yeah. There's weird license stuff. There's a Sesame Street plug and play that's just like brand new Elmo games that are on the NES. Like there's I'm having a hard time thinking. There's an American Idol NES based system. There's a lot of stuff like Golden Nugget Casino. There's in 2005 Majesco released a plug and play system that was running NES under the hood and had brand new Konami games on it. So like Frogger for the NES came out in 2005, but it's like people don't think of it as an NES game because it's not on a cartridge. It's like hidden.
Sure, but you're talking about the actual game that's on the plug and play. It's not a separate hidden game that isn't accessible. Okay.
Correct. Okay. So what I'm saying is if you got the data off of that plug and play, you could burn it on a cartridge and play it in your NES.
I really think that should be done. That there should be some sort of either some sort of flash card or a giant multi-card of these things should be made. I know it'll be illegal as heck. I don't even care.
Well, there are luckily some good preservation efforts to get the data off of these. And it's come. I just donated a bunch of them last year. But my point is that last year, maybe the year before, I started really just doing like the weirdest hacky like eBay and Amazon searches you could, just trying to find all of them. And I feel pretty. I mean, I just found another one a few months ago, so I'm not done. I don't know if it's ever done, but I found a lot of systems that people just didn't know about that had new NES games on them. My favorite is actually one called King Fishing, and it's a fishing reel that's an NES inside, and it has a brand new fishing game in it, and it actually reads like tilt, so you can cast your lure by flicking. And then when you crank the reel, you can hear it clicking, and all it's really doing is just hitting one of the buttons, probably A or something, like really fast, and that's how it determines how fast you're reeling. It's just really inventive use of the NES. That's it's as an historian or archivist or whatever you want to call me, it's like I try to focus on the things that are actually important to people, but you have to go down these rabbit holes of things that tickle you personally, So I have spent some company resources building an archive of terrible plug and play consoles that happen to have NES hardware inside.
Did you manage to get a hold of the Phallic Spider-Man game?
That's not NES, so I didn't.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I know what you're talking about. I would like to play it, but I don't want to have that on my shelf.
That might be in MAME, actually, because there's been, if you follow MAME development lately, a lot of work is actually being put in right now to these plug and play systems. So I'm pretty sure that the Spider-Man one is in MAME. That uses hardware that's common in plug and plays, but is original to plug and plays. I believe it's called the Sun Plus, something like that. Yeah, I'm familiar with the Phallic Spider-Man joystick. It's awful.
What about the first, very, very, very first Atari flashback unit? That was NES, was it not?
It was, yes.
Okay, has that been dumped yet? Because I would love to have that on a cartridge.
I can't remember. I sent it to Sean Riddle. And the thing about these plug and plays is that it's either a you can or you can't with getting the data off using current methods. And I think that one's dumped now. I think we have Atari Flashback now. So I sent that to him to digitize, and I don't know if it's made its way into the MAME sets yet or not. But yes, yes. Now that you ask, yes, I did personally help make that happen. If it happened, I'm pretty sure it did.
Awesome. I'm going to look for that. Okay, Frank. I know you've got a big schedule up today. I don't want to take too much of your time, but I really appreciate you being here.
Yeah.
Where can people follow your archiving efforts and other adventures of yours on the internet?
Yeah, sure. So really the the charity that I founded 4 years ago, we're called the Video Game History Foundation, and where we are on the web is gamehistory.org.
Mm-hmm.
Was so thrilled that no one had taken that. I was just felt miraculous when I tried that. It was like, you put that into the who is, and it's just like, really? Like, no, like, no one has gamehistory.org. So that's where we are, gamehistory.org. We are a charity that is, I'm trying to, I still don't have my elevator pitch down. I really should after 3 years. But essentially, we are trying to make sure that when people are trying to tell the story of video games, that they actually have material to work with. Mm-hmm. Right now, what that means is collecting materials that we feel are volatile that could slip through the cracks and disappear. So, for example, I mean, this one's a little bit easier than most of what we do, but we are building what we think will be the first dedicated library in the U.S. to study the history of video games. We're not there yet, just in terms of like, I can't hire library staff. I can't even hire myself yet. Like we're not well funded enough to entertain researchers. But I mean, we're sitting in my office that's just full of books right now. Well, that's one of 6 shelves. So we're building that, but we're going a little bit beyond that too. We're trying to build out not just the magazines and books, but the material that they used. So we've been digging up things like, I'm trying to see if I do have some on me. So for example, we're trying to find all the like art that video game publishers sent to the magazines, because a lot of that stuff just doesn't exist anymore. So I have on me a binder from GamePro. This is GamePro kept a good art archive of publisher art, and so there's a lot of just high resolution artwork in these CDs.
Oh my!
For games going back to like '96, something like that. And we feel a lot of that stuff. Well, we know a lot of that stuff's endangered. I've sent art to artists and had them go, "Oh my God, I thought this was gone." So we're focusing on stuff like that. And we're also focusing on, we talked a lot about video game source material, source code. That's probably going to be our big push for this year is a video game industry initiative, letting everyone know, like, hey, your old stuff, like that concept art you drew, your design notes, your raw code, things like that, like that stuff's actually important, and there's a home for it now. Let's start working together and figuring this out. So that's where we're focused now. We just published something that's sort of a preview of what we're doing with the source code push, which is that we just helped the family of a deceased engineer, Chris Oberth, who unfortunately passed in 2012. We just helped his surviving family go through the archives that he left behind. He left behind floppy disks and tapes and things like that. And we actually rebuilt from his source code a game for the NES that never shipped.
Days of Thunder?
Yes. So it's a game based on Days of Thunder, the Tom Cruise movie. Yes, there is a Days of Thunder that was shipped on the NES. This is the first one that wasn't shipped, that they put in a drawer and started over. And the point isn't like that we unearthed this amazing new game that's going to make you rethink the NES. You know what I mean? Like, oh, this would have been a hit. No, that's not the point. The point is that we can tell stories. We can expose work from artists that and respect. Like Chris Oberth wrote Anteater, which is a really seminal arcade game. That was a really important game to history. That it was cloned very successfully. That's how successful it was. And this is kind of a lost piece of that guy's career. So we've got a lot of content coming up based around that, and trying to figure out how do we capture as much of this raw material as we can while the people who made it are still alive, because frankly there just hasn't been an effort to my satisfaction to do that yet. So that's what we're working on now. And if that sort of thing is interesting to you and you want to join us, come take a look, gamehistory.org. We've got a Patreon, Discord access, stuff like that if you want to come hang out.
I'm going to make sure all of those things get linked in the show notes on my website, aaronbossig.com.
Great.
So if you missed any of it, you can definitely check that out.
Cool. And then I have a personal Twitter too, but it's mostly screaming about racial injustice right now, so maybe not.
Well, it's there if anybody wants it. I'll make sure they can find it.
Cool. At Frank Cifaldi.
Okay, Frank, thank you so much for being here. I'll be glad to have you back anytime. It's a great chat.
Yeah, anytime.
Okay, talk to you soon.
All right, bye.